Good evening, everyone. Tonight we'll begin with a somewhat somber topic and delve into the silent killer that swept across the globe a century ago, the 1918 influenza pandemic. If you think recent experiences give you insight into what a pandemic truly is, set aside all preconceived notions. This was not breaking news on your phone, nor is it the routine of working from home. This was an era without antibiotics or ventilators. The medical community was only just beginning to understand the enemy they faced. The ordinary people of 1918 weren't nostalgic figures from vintage postcards, but individuals living in stark terror. Tonight, you won't be a passive viewer of a documentary. You will become someone living in that world. A stranger's light cough on the streetcar could become a death sentence within 48 hours. Before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of historical depth, please take a moment to like and subscribe to this story. Feel free to tell me where you're from in the comments. It's always fascinating to see listeners join from around the globe. Now, dim the lights. Let's begin tonight's journey together. The biting cold of January 1918, in the forgotten corner of Haskell County, Kansas, where the world seemed nothing but endless plains and the ceaseless howling wind across the grasslands. A country doctor, Raylan Miner, began to notice something amiss. Dr. Miner was a cautious man. He was well minus acquainted with the rhythms of life and illness in farming communities. He understood seasonal influenza, arriving punctually each winter, predictable and manageable. But this time was different. People fell ill with alarming speed. The symptoms were fierce and brutal. This flu struck like a heavy blow. Strong, healthy men would be racked by fever within hours, agonizing pain like every bone cracking. Forced to bed, Miner watched with deep concern as this unusually fierce illness spread from one farmhouse to another in the small community. He noticed it favored the young and healthy, those who usually shrugged off the common cold. He witnessed some patients develop fulminant pneumonia, dying within mere days. This was no ordinary flu. In this small world, such a striking statistical anomaly prompted him to take action rarely seen among country doctors at the time. He wrote to the Journal of the U.S. Public Health Service, warning of an impending severe influenza outbreak. Though published, the letter was ignored. The world had more pressing concerns. War raged in Europe. America's war machine churned at full speed. Haskell County, like countless rural areas across America, was sending its sons to the front lines. Young farmhands, accustomed to the open air of the fields and relative solitude, bid farewell to their families and headed for training camps. One such massive military base, Camp Fenton, rose as if from the barren plains of Kansas, part of the Fort Riley military complex. Late February, several young men from Haskell, likely the symptomatic carriers or recovered from that strange flu, reported to the camp to begin training. They brought not only meager belongings and dreams of glory in France, but also carried the virus. Camp Fenton was essentially a temporary city, built for industrial minor-scale production of cannon fodder. Over 50,000 soldiers were crammed into unheated wooden barracks. In these dormitories, designed for far fewer occupants than housed there, bunks were packed so tightly one could reach out and touch the next bed. The air inside was a thick mix of coal stove smoke, the stench of sweat, human breath, and the ever-present fine dust of the Kansas plains, seeping through every crack. Worse still, the winter of 1918 proved exceptionally harsh. To shield themselves from the biting cold, soldiers sealed their barracks windows and doors shut, unwittingly creating the perfect greenhouse for respiratory pathogens. Not to mention the manure problem. Thousands of military mules and horses produced tons of waste daily. To manage this waste, the military maintained massive, round clock burning piles, filling the air with acrid, pungent smoke, irritating lungs and making ice water. In this overcrowded, poorly ventilated environment where lungs were constantly assaulted, the virus from Haskell County didn't just find a place to stay, it found paradise. Early on the morning of March 4, 1918, a regimental cook named Albert G. H. Elliot reported to the camp infirmary. He complained of headaches, fever, and a sore throat, classic flu symptoms. No alarm was raised at the time. After taking his temperature, the doctor ordered him to bed. G. H. Elliot is often, though not precisely, regarded as patient zero of this pandemic. Of course, he was not the first case. The virus had actually been lurking in the camp for weeks, but he was the first officially recorded case. At this location, which would later become the largest source of the epidemic spread, by noon that day, over 100 soldiers with identical symptoms had followed G. H. Elliot to the infirmary. By the weekend, the number of patients had exceeded 500. The camp infirmary, with its limited capacity, was completely overwhelmed. Temporary hospitals had to be hastily set up in large buildings like hangars. Endless rows of hospital beds stretched on and on. Medical personnel and supplies were both severely lacking. Only basic care and weight monitoring could be provided, though the scale of the outbreak was staggering. War had its own urgent demands. The U.S. Army adhered to an ironclad logistical principle. The flow of frontline troops must never be interrupted, no matter the emergency. Even a seemingly severe flu outbreak is merely an obstacle, not an impasse. So when thousands fell ill at Fort Fenton, tens of thousands of healthy but potentially infected soldiers still embarked on their journey. They crammed into crowded trains, traversing military bases across the nation's four corners, spreading the virus at every stop. Georgia base, Virginia base, Massachusetts base. Within a single month, 24 of the nation's 36 major military bases experienced severe outbreaks. From these bases, the soldiers' next destination was East Coast embarkation ports, such as Newport News and New York City. Soldiers were crammed into transport ships, giant vessels like the Leviathan. This former German ocean liner, now requisitioned, could carry over 10,000 soldiers per voyage. Conditions aboard were even harsher than the camps. Soldiers slept in rows of suspended hammocks, so close together their breath mingled into a collective cloud. The air below deck was foul and stagnant. The floating incubators raced across the Atlantic. Thus the virus, conceived in the quiet of Kansas farms and tempered in the crucible of military camps, set sail. World War I, with its insatiable demand for manpower and astonishing global logistical network, unwittingly became the most efficient transmission system a pandemic could dream of. Those famous American infantrymen, commonly known as the Flower Boys, carried to the European trenches not only rifles and ideals, but also the seeds of plague, whose scale of devastation would dwarf the war itself. The crucible of war forged this biological weapon, now delivering it to every front. Spring 1918, when U.S. troop transports arrived at French ports like Brest and Bordeaux, the virus disembarked and began its spread. With stealthy efficiency, it first ravaged Allied soldiers on the Western Front, then crossed the lines to infect German troops, soon permeating civilian societies in France, British, Italian, and German civilian populations. Yet this initial manifestation of the disease, what we now call the first wave, harbored a peculiar deception. Its contagiousness was undeniably fierce, spreading like wildfire between towns. However, its lethality was comparatively low. The symptoms, though severe, resembled a familiar flu, a high fever lasting 3 to 4 days, muscle aches, coughing, and profound exhaustion. People called it the 3-day fever or Flanders fever. Most infected individuals, though suffering greatly, fully recovered within a week, while the mortality rate was slightly higher than that of regular seasonal flu. It did not trigger panic. It seemed merely a severe flu, causing minor disruption during the World War. Neither military nor government authorities paid it much attention. When daily headlines were dominated by reports of hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed in battle, a flu outbreak claiming only a few lives was clearly insignificant. Wartime news censorship further reinforced this false sense of security. Germany, France, Britain, and the United States, all belligerent nations, strictly suppressed news of the epidemic within their borders. Admitting that troops and factory workers were being ravaged by the flu would have devastated morale and provided ammunition for enemy propaganda. Therefore, discussion of the topic was completely suppressed. Newspapers overflowed with reports of victories and heroic deeds, with no mention of soldiers bedridden with fever. It was precisely this censorship that gave the pandemic its misleading and enduring name, the Spanish flu. Spain remained neutral during World War I, and its news media were not subject to military censorship. When the flu spread to Madrid in May 1918, local newspapers were free to report on the epidemic. Large numbers of people in the capital fell ill, public services were disrupted, and even news of King Alfonso II's serious illness was published. Because reports of the epidemic seemed to originate only from Spain, the rest of the world assumed it had originated there. This is a classic case of blaming the messenger. With some resentment, Spaniards dubbed it the Neapolitan soldier, after a popular operetta then playing in Madrid, suggesting the disease spread as catchy and rapidly as its title. Yet the name Spanish flu ultimately prevailed. This unfair label obscured its likely origin on the American plains. Spring to early summer of 1918, this pandemic swept across the globe, spreading along trade and military routes to Africa, India, and Asia. The scenes were strikingly similar everywhere. This astonishingly contagious disease was rarely fatal. People gradually grew accustomed to it. Though it disrupted daily life and the war effort, it did not pose a threat to survival. Doctors, drawing on past influenza, the pandemics, such as the one in 1889, anticipated the virus would naturally subside, weakening with each transmission. They believed the worst had passed. They were wrong, dead wrong. Far from disappearing, the virus was learning, yet persisted in spreading, mutating, biding its time. The seemingly mild appearance of the first wave was not nature's mercy. It was merely the prelude, the harbinger. It lured the world into a false sense of security, fostering global complacency, to make the subsequent blow all the more devastating. The spring outbreak was like the quiet swell before a tsunami, a warning few knew of, and fewer were willing to heed. The true monster was brewing quietly in the most chaotic and crowded places on Earth at the time, the ports and transit camps of northern France. The summer of 1918 brought a false calm to much of the northern hemisphere. With the arrival of warmer weather, the first wave of influenza seemed to recede. Cases plummeted. The world collectively breathed a sigh of relief. Attention turned entirely back to the war entering its decisive phase. Germany's spring offensive had failed. The Allies, bolstered by a steady stream of American reinforcements, were preparing a counter-offensive to end the war. French ports, especially Brest in Brittany, became the busiest, noisiest places on Earth. Brest functioned like a giant human funnel, through which hundreds of thousands of American troops landed each month, to pass through transit camps en route to the front lines. Simultaneously, thousands of wounded or rotating veterans passed through in the opposite direction. This place was both a convergence point and a melting pot, bringing together people from all corners of the globe, soldiers from every U.S. state, colonial laborers, soldiers from across Europe, and immigrants and refugees from around the globe all crossed paths here. At the same time, thousands of wounded or rotating veteran soldiers passed through in the opposite direction. This place was both a crossroads and a biological melting pot, bringing together people from every corner of the world, soldiers from every U.S. state, Indochina, Sudan, Algeria, colonial laborers, British, Canadian, Australian, French, and other nations' armies. Each carried a unique microbial community, bearing the history of exposure to distinct viral and bacterial strains. In this overcrowded, stressful environment, soldiers weakened by exhaustion from long marches and malnutrition. The influenza virus found an unprecedented evolutionary laboratory here. This was not a single mutation at a single location, but a continuous process of selection and adaptation. This virus, an envelope of genetic material inherently prone to astonishing replication errors, replicated billions of times within the soldiers' bodies. Most mutations were useless or even harmful to the virus itself, but occasionally a variant emerged that conferred an advantage. Summer 1918. Somewhere within this genetic melting pot, a new variant emerged. It may have originated in Brest, or appeared at the nearby deadliest transit camp. This notorious British military base had also experienced a mysterious respiratory outbreak in 1916. No one knows the exact moment or location, but we know the virus had mutated. It underwent what virologists call antigenecking drift. Simply put, the virus completely altered its appearance and structure. This caused the human immune system, which had recognized and fought the spring strain, to lose all ability to identify this new variant. In essence, it was a new virus, and its lethality was terrifying. The new strain no longer contented itself with inducing a 3-day fever, but attacked the lungs with unprecedented ferocity. It learned to penetrate deep into lung tissue, destroying cells and causing extensive hemorrhaging. But its most terrifying weapon was its ability to manipulate the host's own immune system, turning it against itself, particularly in young, healthy individuals with peak immune function. The virus triggered an uncontrolled reaction, known as a cytokine storm. Cytokines are proteins used by the immune system to transmit signals and coordinate the body's defenses. In a normal response, they are essential, but in this scenario, the virus causes the body to unleash a massive, chaotic flood of cytokine proteins into the lung. Far from forming a coordinated defense, this devolves into indiscriminate bombardment. The body's own white blood cells and fluids flood into the lungs, attempting to annihilate the invaders through destructive means. But in the process, they destroy the fragile lung tissue. The infected essentially drown in their own bodily fluids. This is the most deadly irony of the new virus strain. Those with the strongest immunity become the most vulnerable. Their formidable defenses become a death sentence. The symptoms of this novel influenza are both terrifying and swift. Patients feel perfectly healthy in the morning, develop fever and flu-like symptoms by noon, and succumb to the disease by nightfall. The most striking feature is violet cyanosis on the face, particularly around the lips and ears where a bluish-purple discoloration appears. This is the visual sign of blood oxygen deprivation, a warning of rapidly failing lung function. Doctors encountering this symptom for the first time often misdiagnosed it as plague or cholera, rather than influenza. They had never seen influenza cause such symptom. By late August 1918, this novel and deadly virus was poised to strike, ready to sweep across the globe. Once again, the machinery of war became the virus's transportation system. From French ports, the virus spread simultaneously in 3 directions. Eastward with troops heading to the front lines, ravaging both sides of the trenches southward across France, spreading to other parts of Europe and North Africa, most chillingly westward. The ships that had transported troops to Europe were now preparing to return to the United States, Britain, and Canada. Some vessels carried wounded soldiers, others transported rotating personnel. Still others sailed back empty of people, but laden with cargo. And, aboard all these ships, the new virus strain spread silently, like invisible stowaways. In August, this deadly and rapidly spreading influenza outbreak erupted almost simultaneously in 3 port cities thousands of miles apart: Freetown, Sierra Leone, a key British naval port, Boston, USA, a vital naval base and military entry point, and Brest, France, the epicenter of the outbreak. The second wave of death was unleashed. This mutated virus, forged in the chaos of war, had reached perfection. The false tranquility of summer was about to shatter. The world was entering the deadliest 3 months in human history. The deceptive spring wave was merely a prelude. Now the curtain rises on the main. As the summer light of 1918 faded, so too did memories of that strange, yet relatively mild spring illness. The war, that great war, still raged. Its demands were absolute. The world's gaze was fixed upon the Flanders battlefields and the Argonne forest. The epidemic many called 3-day fever seemed a fading, unpleasant memory, nearly a more bothersome seasonal flu than usual. Yet beneath the surface, in the hidden corners of the microscopic world, the virus had never vanished. It continued to migrate, learning, mutating. Within the crowded barracks and the bodies of millions of soldiers, it found the perfect training ground. In the month of August, as the leaves began to contemplate changing color, this mutated virus, now transformed into a highly efficient killer, decided to make its reappearance. It did not emerge in a single location, but erupted almost simultaneously in 3 places, 3 ports, 3 festering wounds, looming across the world map, allowing infection to spread like ink seeping through blotting paper. The first stain was Brest, France, the main landing port for American forces. Thousands of vibrant, patriotic recruits arrived daily by ship, ready to turn the tide of war. Yet aboard the ships that carried them, a new virus brewed in sailors' lungs. The second stain was the Union Wharf in Boston, Massachusetts. A ship from Europe docked, sickly sailors scattered throughout the city. The third epicenter was Freetown, Sierra Leone. This West African stronghold was a vital British naval base. The Royal Navy ship HMS Manua arrived carrying sickroom embers. The plague landed with them. It spread as easily as a spark in dry hay. Brest, Boston, Freetown, 3 port cities. At this moment, this beach had faced an invasion far deadlier than any commander could have imagined. This was no spring flu. That was merely a rehearsal. Now came the main event. The disease that erupted in late August held unprecedented terror. Its incubation period was dizzyingly short, sometimes mere hours. One might be perfectly healthy at breakfast, then lie feverish and bedridden by lunchtime. Initial symptoms seemed familiar. Fever, headache, severe muscle aches. But then the illness would take a sudden turn for the worse. The patient's lungs begin to fail. The cough transforms from dry to wet, accompanied by phlegm. The patient coughs up frothy sputum, often streaked with blood. Breathing becomes rapid and shallow. This is the body's desperate struggle against oxygen it cannot process. Then comes the second wave, the most vivid and terrifying sign, gyanosis. As the lungs fill with bloody fluid and cease functioning, oxygen saturation plummets. The patient's skin begins to change color. This is not the hue of an ordinary illness, but is sinister, dark purple. The discoloration starts at the extremities. A faint blue, like diluted ink, appears on fingertips and earlobes. It then spreads to the limbs, creeping up arms and legs, staining the face. The skin turns deep purple, sometimes nearly black. At the time, physicians attempted to name this gothic nightmare of a symptom, calling it violet hemorrhagic syndrome, derived from the color of violets. This poetic description actually mirrors the terrifying progression of the disease. Witnessing a loved one gradually turn blue before your eyes is akin to witnessing death unfold in real time. Patients' complexions darkened so profoundly that distinguishing white from black soldiers became impossible. One physician noted with chilling detachment, only by examining the souls of the deceased could race be discerned. This plague, dubbed Purple Death by the press, spread with alarming speed. The resulting pneumonia proved unprecedentedly lethal. This was no mild, unilateral lung infection, but rather massive hemorrhagic pneumonia, transforming both lungs into heavy, waterlogged, oxygen-deprived masses, resembling livers. Autopsies revealed lung weights to 2-3 times normal, filled with red, frothy fluid. Patients were essentially drowning in their own bodily fluids. suffocating to death on trial and in hospital beds or at home. A soldier in his prime, admitted to the military hospital at dawn, is sent to the morgue by dusk. Such scenes are all too common. This disease inexplicably favors the young and robust, targeting those between 20 and 40 years of age. Their vigorous and aggressive immune systems overreact to the virus, triggering what is now termed a cytokine storm. Their very strengths became fatal weaknesses. The body's defense system panicked, fought the invader with all its might. Cells and fluid flooded the lungs, destroying the very tissues it was meant to protect. The body declared war upon itself. The battlefield was the lungs. In this brutal, swift civil war, few survived. The autumn of 1918 became a season of terror. The 4-year war suddenly faced a rival. An unnamed purple death swept across the globe, and it exploited precisely the infrastructure humanity had built to destroy each other. The engines of war ironically became the engines of plague. The spread of this deadly new virus was a masterpiece of logistical efficiency, unwittingly proving the global interdependence forged by war. The world at the dawn of the 20th century felt smaller than ever before. Steamships crossed oceans in days, not months. Rail networks spread like spiderwebs across continents. And in 1918, all infrastructure served a single purpose: transporting the manpower and supplies of war. The virus boarded these vessels. Warships became the primary carriers across oceans. Consider ships like the Leviathan. This former German ocean liner was converted into a troop transport, capable of carrying over 10,000 soldiers at once. From the lower holds to the deck's beds, stacked layer upon layer were packed with people. Ventilation was extremely poor. The air thick with a viscous mixture of breath, sweat, and billions of viral particles. These ships became perfect floating petri dishes. A single infected soldier boarding in New York could trigger hundreds of cases by mid-Atlantic and spread 2,000s by rivaling Britain. The voyage began with young men singing and brimming with enthusiasm, but ended with hundreds of sick and mobile soldiers disembarking, and dozens of bodies shrouded in canvas being unloaded. September 1918, an escort fleet carrying 20,000 American troops to France recorded over 2,000 deaths during the crossing alone. These ships became known as floating coffins. The ocean transformed into a vast, nameless graveyard. When the ships reached port, the virus landed with the soldiers. Departing from Bristol port, infected soldiers, though still asymptomatic, were loaded onto trains bound for the front lines. At every stop along the way, every French village station, became a new opportunity for the virus to spread to local residents. Departing from Freetown, Royal Navy vessels carried the epidemic to other African ports. The virus then spread inland, along trade routes and colonial railways. This pandemic swept across Africa with terrifying speed and intensity, devastating populations with no immunity and primitive or non-existent healthcare system. The same pattern emerged within the United States. After an outbreak at Camp Evans, a large military training camp in Boston, the virus spread rapidly. On a certain day in September, the camp reported 1,543 new cases in a single day. 543 cases. Military trains departing from Devons and other East Coast camps spread the epidemic inland. Along major rail lines, the flu swept westward within weeks, from Boston to Chicago, from Chicago to Kansas City, and from Kansas City to San Francisco. This train-minus-like wave was unstoppable. Philadelphia ignored doctors' warnings, held a massive war bonds parade in late September, with hundreds of thousands flooding the streets. 2 days later, city hospitals were overwhelmed. Thousands died within a week. Coffins were even in short supply. The virus knew no borders or front lines, spreading like wildfire in the trenches of the Western Front. Soldiers from Germany, France, Britain, and the United States were all vulnerable. Some historians note Germany's final offensive in the spring of 1918 was halted, not only by Allied resistance, but also because its assault troops were decimated by the first wave of influenza. The second wave proved even more devastating. German war strategist General Erich von Rommel stated bluntly that influenza was the primary cause of low troop morale and the inability to withstand the Allies' final offensive. This pandemic knew no enemy or ally, weakening all sides equally, accelerating the end of a war already drained of manpower. Within a mere 3 months, from September to November 1918, the virus spread across every inhabited continent. It arrived by ship in South Africa, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives within weeks when it reached India. The final death toll would be in the millions, potentially reaching 5% of the subcontinent's total population. It arrived in Australia, aboard returning naval vessels, forcing the nation into strict quarantine. Even the most remote Pacific islands were not spared. In Western Samoa, the SS Oloan, a ship from New Zealand, introduced the epidemic. Within just 2 months, 22% of the island's population perished. The virus had transformed the arteries of empire and war, transforming the globe into its exclusive highway system. The entire world became an interconnected trap, with nowhere to flee. This plague, originating somewhere in the world, now permeated every corner. The enemy humanity faced was invisible, unamable, and beyond negotiation. In the trenches of this new war, medical personnel would soon discover their utter helplessness. As the epidemic spread with astonishing speed, physicians and scientists in 1918 found the medical community nearly paralyzed by helplessness. Experts who had taken pride in decades of progress in bacteriology and public health now faced an adversary beyond all comprehension. They fought in darkness, battling an invisible, ruthless foe within makeshift medical trenches. The primary and most fundamental problem was they had no idea what caused the disease. Pasteur's germ theory was the absolute dogma of the medical world at the time. Research efforts were entirely focused on finding the bacterial culprit. The prime suspect was the Haemophilus influenzae discovered by Richard Pfeffer in 1892. Its scientific name was Haemophilus influenzae. It was widely believed this bacterium was the culprit behind influenza. From the Rockefeller Institute in New York to the Pasteur Institute in Paris, teams of the world's top bacteriologists raced against time to isolate Pfeffer's Haemophilus influenzae from patients. Sometimes they succeeded in isolating it. Other times they found nothing. They attempted to prepare vaccines from this bacterium and other bacterial cultures isolated from patients. These hastily developed and distributed vaccines were at best useless against influenza itself, though they might offer some protection against secondary bacterial pneumonia. The truth was, of course, the real culprit was not a bacterium at all. The real culprit was a virus, a microorganism too small to be observed by microscopes at the time. They were chasing the tracks of an elephant, only to be trampled by a swarm of invisible ants. In the absence of known causes and specific treatments, physicians could only revert to established methods, symptomatic relief and various therapies, ranging from well-intentioned, yet ineffective prescriptions to outright life-threatening intervention. Cold baths and aspirin were administered for fevers. In fact, aspirin, hailed as a novel wonder drug at the time, was prescribed in massive quantities. The U.S. Surgeon General even recommended daily doses as high as 30 grams. We now know this dosage is toxic, potentially causing pulmonary edema and fluid buildup in the lungs. Ironically, certain standard treatments actually contributed to high mortality rates, exacerbating the critical fatal symptoms of influenza. Other therapies epitomized the pharmacopoeia of the era. Quinine, a malaria treatment, was widely administered. The stimulant strychnine was deployed on battlefields. Arsenic and mercury compounds were used in desperate attempts to kill unknown pathogens. Ancient methods like bloodletting were revived. These measures further depleted the already critically ill patient's strength. To stimulate cardiac function, camphor oil was injected. All treatments proved ineffective. When ineffective medications were exhausted, Doctors could only watch helplessly as patients turned blue and suffocated to death. Perhaps the greatest obstacle was the lack of treatment for complications. In the 1918 flu fatalities, most did not die directly from the virus, but from secondary bacterial pneumonia. The virus acted like a battering ram, shattering the lungs' natural defense system. Once this barrier collapsed, harmless bacterial like Streptococcus and Staphylococcus, normally residing in the throat, invaded the damaged lung tissue. This dual infection of virus and bacteria created a perfect storm. Yet the world of 1918 had no antibiotics. Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin was still a decade away, and its clinical application required over 2 more years. Faced with these secondary bacterial infections, doctors were powerless, offering only sportive care to maintain patients' hydration, body temperature, and comfort, hoping the body could overcome the disease on its own. But in most cases, the body ultimately succumbed to the illness. As patient numbers surged, healthcare systems worldwide became overwhelmed and collapsed. Within mere days, hospitals were operating beyond capacity. Schools, churches, and armories were hastily converted into makeshift treatment centers. Tent cities sprang up in public parks to house the sick. Yet the problem extended beyond space shortages to a critical shortage of personnel. Doctors and nurses worked 18-hour shifts surrounded by death and disease, with alarming rates of infection among themselves. In many cities, half the medical staff were already unable to work. Third- and fourth-year medical students were recalled from classroom and sent directly to wards to learn on the job. A desperate call for volunteers was issued to anyone willing to risk their lives caring for the sick. Nurses, in particular, became the unsung heroes of this pandemic, offering comfort and basic care when medicine failed. They faced scenes of apocalyptic proportions, hundreds of men coughing blood in wards, stretchers forming endless queues in corridors. Convoys to the morgue never cease. The collapse extends beyond hospitals. The entire life, minus death, infrastructure has broken down. Funeral homes run out of space and manpower. Coffin makers struggle to meet demand. Bodies piled for days in Philadelphia homes, uncollected. Steam excavators and horse-drawn carts were forced to haul corpses from sidewalks. Mass graves were hastily dug, because gravities were either sick or dead. Individual graves could not be dug in time. Telephone lines were paralyzed as operators fell ill. Garbage collection ground to a halt. Farms lack workers to harvest crops. Social structure begins to unravel. Amidst this chaos, William H. Welch of Johns Hopkins Hospital and teams like the Rockefeller Institute strive for scientific solutions. They see themselves as soldiers in another war, a war against ignorance and disease. Yet every negative bacterial culture result, every failed experimental vaccine, meant fresh setbacks. Helplessness surged like a flood. From the confidence of bacteriology's golden age, they plummeted into a terrifying realization. This force before them was utterly beyond human control. Human civilization, at the peak of industrial and military might, was crushed by a microscopic entity, invisible to the naked eye. Autumn of 1918 dragged on gloomily, revealing the limits of human knowledge. In that season, the only truly effective treatments were rest, fresh air, the tender care of nurses, and boundless luck. Then the world began to close, not with a sudden slam, but with a silent, creaking slide. The bolt gently clicked into place. Public health authorities, gripped by conflicting theories and unmasked panic, began pulling each lever of society, hoping one might halt this invisible machine of death. The first lever targeted was leisure and entertainment. Places where people gathered for recreation suddenly became epicenters of the outbreak. Theaters, variety halls, dance halls, skating rinks, those temples of laughter and romance, fell suddenly silent. Neon lights flickered and died. Posters heralding screen stars like Mary Pickford or Charlie Chaplin faded in sunlight no theater seat could reach. In cities like Chicago and New York, the shutdown orders were issued almost timidly, in stages. First came the advice to avoid gatherings, then the ban on indoor performances, finally the complete shutdown. Theater operators naturally protested vehemently. They spoke of economic collapse, public morale, the right to assemble, but these arguments were ultimately drowned out by the coughing echoing through the streets. After theaters, it was schools' turn. Closing campuses seemed logical. Those children, like sources of infection, gathered in groups, sharing inkwells, secrets, now sharing a deadly virus. Thousands of schools across the nation shut their doors. Playgrounds once filled with laughter grew eerily silent. Only the wind rustled through empty swings. Yet this measure still lacks universal acceptance. Dr. Royal Copeland, New York's health commissioner, strongly advocates keeping schools open. His argument, though unconventional, is not without merit. He contends that children in urban slums are safer under nurses' supervision, where early symptoms can be detected promptly, than left in crowded, unsanitary tenements. For these children, school is a sanctuary, not a breeding ground for infection. This debate holds no simple answer. It represents one of many moral and logistical choices the pandemic presents daily. Churches were subsequently closed. This may have been the hardest measure for the public to accept. At a time when people, shrouded in fear and death, craved faith and communal solace most, they were denied access to places of worship. On Sunday mornings, the bells of many cities fell suddenly silent. This was not always due to decree. Sometimes it was simply because there were not enough healthy parishioners to fill the pews, or the priest himself lay ill in bed. Public funerals were abandoned. Influenza victims were buried hastily, often with only a handful of masked mourners maintaining awkward distance at private ceremonies. Death became an administrative procedure, stripped of all comforting rituals. Weddings were forbidden, baptisms cancelled, life's most sacred moments paused. The streets, the beating heart of urban life, grew empty as quarantine orders tightened. Some cities posted colored signs on infected households' doors, yellow, blue reed signs, representing influenza, pneumonia, or dual infections. These markers, like branding irons, warned neighbors, milkmen, postmen to keep their distance. Communities fractured into isolated units. People peered from behind curtains, casting suspicious glances at any cough on the sidewalk. San Francisco even issued an order that if a streetcar is full, it must skip designated stops to avoid crowding, resulting in streetcars merely rumbling past, leaving frustrated, masked commuters lining the streets. And the mask was precisely the key. The gauze mask has become the iconic symbol of this pandemic. These thin pieces of fabric are mostly homemade, their protective effectiveness highly questionable. Yet their widespread adoption represents a massive public psychological operation. Wearing a mask was not merely a protective measure, but a declaration of civic duty, signifying that an individual was doing their part. In cities like San Francisco, Seattle, and Denver, authorities issued mandates requiring masks in public spaces. Police hunted down those daring to show their faces. Newspapers published photos of mass crowds, masked police officers, masked judges presiding over masked courtrooms. Even dedicated masked courts were established to adjudicate violators. This surreal spectacle resembled a citywide Marco Polo Minus-style masquerade ball. Of course, dissent emerged. Anti-Minus mask coalitions sprang up, claiming the mandates infringed on personal liberty. They accused masks of being ineffective and uncomfortable, and represent an abuse of governmental power. Though this group remains a minority, the protests foreshadow recurring debates to come. The cumulative impact of these measures has transformed the bustling metropolis into a desolate ghost town. The roar of traffic has been replaced by the echo of footsteps. Once minus-crowded commercial streets now stand deserted. Shops shut their doors, window displaced and empty. The air, once thick with coal smoke, The scent of horses and street food has now been replaced by the smell of disinfectant and phenol. After nightfall, the darkness deepened. With theatres and halls closed, the city loses its nocturnal glow. Only the lights of pharmacies remain ablaze, like solitary lighthouses in a sea of silent dread. Daily life has been compressed to the most basic necessities: foraging for sustenance, avoiding contact, seeking survival. The world has grown smaller, quieter, more terrifying. Amidst this global silence, a question begins to float in the air, whispered through telegraph lines, shouted from the headlines of the few censored newspapers. Where did this plague come from? The answer, or at least the answer the world chose to adopt, would prove as unjust as the virus itself. This pandemic was dubbed the Spanish flu, a name that has lingered in collective memory for over a century. Euphonious and suggestive, yet utterly false. Spain was not the origin of the outbreak, nor bore greater responsibility for its spread than any other nation. In fact, it suffered more grievously. Why Spain? The answer lies not in virology, but in wartime propaganda and censorship. Spring 1918. World War I raged at its most intense. The Central Powers, led by Germany and Austria, and minus Hungary, locked in mortal combat with the Entente Powers, led by Britain, France, and the United States. Against this backdrop, information became a weapon. Morale, whether on the front lines or in the rear, was a strategic resource as precious as ammunition and food. And the news most capable of shattering morale was that soldiers, besides facing machine gun fire and mustard gas attacks, were also being ravaged by mysterious disease. Thus the belligerent nations deployed the tactic they mastered best in wartime. Germany, France, Britain, and the United States took complete control of the narrative. News media faced strict military censorship. Publications were forbidden from printing anything that might harm the war effort or unsettle the populace. Detailed reports of the flu epidemic spreading like wildfire through military camps and industrial cities undoubtedly fell into this category of forbidden topics. Thus, the media chose silence. The occasional flu reports that did appear were always brief, vague, and reassuring. They referred to it as the 3-day flu or brief discomfort. The true scale of the problem was deliberately concealed. The military doctors reported alarming infection rates to their superiors. These reports were classified as confidential. The citizens of Paris, London, or Berlin remained largely unaware, at least initially. But one nation in Western Europe did not play this game: Spain. Spain maintained neutrality during World War I. Its news media were not subject to wartime censorship. Spanish newspapers were free to report on domestic developments. By late May 1918, an anomaly unfolded within its borders. A peculiar wave of illness swept across the nation. Its speed of transmission and potency of infection were unprecedented. The outbreak began in Madrid and rapidly spread. Tram services in the capital were reduced due to a shortage of healthy drivers. Government offices emptied. Even King Alfonso XII fell ill. Meanwhile, Spanish media outlets like ABC and El Heraldo, El Alma, meticulously documented these events, detailing symptom descriptions, infection counts, and the shutdown of university theatres. This coverage stemmed not from a more severe Spanish outbreak, but purely from the media's comparative advantage. When international news agencies disseminated these reports worldwide, a misleading impression instantly took hold. Amidst global media silence, news from Spain painted a terrifying picture of a nationwide pandemic. The flu appeared to have spread across all of Spain. This was purely a difference in information visibility. At the time, only Spain was publicly documenting the epidemic's progress. Therefore, the world naturally assumed the outbreak originated in Spain, or that the situation there was particularly dire. Foreign correspondents based in Madrid began reporting on the Spanish flu. This name stuck. It was short and memorable. It also diverted public attention away from domestic outbreaks. For high-ranking commanders, of the Allied powers and Central Powers. This proved an invaluable propaganda tool. They could label the disease an exotic plague, shifting blame abroad, rather than admit outbreaks were ravaging their own barracks and factories. The name Spanish flu thus became a convenient smokescreen. This unintentional misattribution was etched into history as an unjust stigma. Spain naturally protested. Its diplomats and journalists pointed out that the epidemic had already spread to French front lines and other locations, long before reaching Madrid, but their voices were drowned out by the clamour of war. This unjust label became fixed. Thus, the origin of this pandemic likely lay in military camps in Kansas, USA, British field hospitals in France, or even China, would forever bear the name of an innocent nation. The tragedy of this country lay solely in possessing a free press at the wrong moment. The name was a lie, but the spread of the disease was a terrifying truth. This influenza knew no borders, and its global journey was about to reach devastating proportions. The injustice of the name was merely the prelude to its merciless rampage. Viruses do not consult maps. It does not respect passports. It rides the lungs of soldiers crossing the Atlantic. It travels in train carriages linking cities. It floats on steamships connecting continents. Its path of spread stands as a terrifying testament to the new global interdependence forged by the industrial age. No place on earth remained safe, and the city of Philadelphia most dramatically revealed the logistical catastrophe unleashed by this pandemic. September 1918. Philadelphia hummed like a wartime hive. Shipyards frantically built vessels. Factories churned out munitions for the front lines. To raise funds, the government promoted war bonds through massive patriotic rallies, known as Liberty Loans. The city's public health commissioner, Wilma Cruson, knew the flu was already spreading throughout the region and was particularly severe near the naval shipyard. Doctors warned him and pleaded for him to cancel the large Liberty Loan parade scheduled for September 28th. They emphasized that gathering hundreds of thousands of people on the streets would be like pouring gasoline on a raging fire. Yet under immense political and patriotic pressure, K. Lewson refused to compromise. He downplayed the epidemic threat, assured the public it was merely ordinary flu, and approved the parade to proceed as scheduled. This decision became one of the most catastrophic public health policy failures in American history. That day, 200,000 people packed Broad Street to watch the flutes, military bands, and marching soldiers. They cheered and sang, while breathing air thick with the virus. The parade became the perfect super-spreader event. Within 72 hours, the catastrophe erupted fully. Philadelphia's hospitals were overwhelmed by a flood of patients. Confirmed cases soared from thousands to tens of thousands. The city lacked efficient medical staff and hospital beds. Patients died at home and in hospital corridors and sidewalks. Then a second crisis emerged: how to handle the dead. Funeral homes ran out of coffins. Carpenters worked day and night but couldn't meet demand. Desperate families left their loved ones wrapped in sheets on doorstep. Coffin wagons were oft uncrewed carts, shuttled through the streets, with drivers shouting, "Bring out your dead." Bodies piled up in makeshift morgues, ICUs, any cool space they could find. A stench of death hung over the entire city. Finally, authorities were forced to deploy steam excavators to dig mass graves in cemeteries. A scene like a medieval nightmare. Within mere weeks, Philadelphia lost over 12,000 lives. A parade meant to celebrate freedom became the city's funeral procession. Philadelphia's tragedy was an urban catastrophe born of population density and fatal decisions. Yet in the most remote corners of the earth, the virus's destructive power showed no sign of waning. It raged even more fiercely. Communities far from metropolises had never encountered common flu strains. Their immunity was virtually non-existent. Take the Inuit villages along the coasts of Alaska and Labrador, for example. These communities remained nearly completely cut off from the world for most of the year. Their only connection to the outside world was the annual visit of supply ships. In the autumn of 1918, these ships brought not only flowers, ammunition, and news, but also the virus. In the village of OK in Labrador, the steamship, days after the ship departed, nearly the entire village fell ill. With no doctors or medicine available, patients died so rapidly that no healthy individuals remained to care for the sick, to tend fires or go hunting. Entire families froze or starved to death in their igloos. Of the village's 266 residents, 200 perished. OK became a ghost town, transformed into a frozen graveyard. Alaska witnessed a similar tragedy. November 1918. The Inupiat village of Brevik Mission Station on the Seward Peninsula. Within 5 days, 80 residents died, 72 of them. The virus arrived via a mail carrier traveling by dog sled. The pandemic's ferocity. Survivors, mostly orphans, could only use steam jettison heirs to dig mass graves in the permafrost, burying their loved ones unmarked. Decades later, in the 1992, scientists excavated the Brevik Mission Cemetery, attempting to extract viral samples and decode its genome. The frozen tragedy of this remote village ironically held the key to unlocking the mystery of its devastation. The 1918 case in the Samoan Islands of the South Pacific perhaps most clearly and cruelly revealed the global impact of this pandemic and the pivotal role of human decision-making. The Samoan Islands were divided at the time. Western Samoa was under New Zealand administration. American Samoa was a U.S. territory. Both territories lay along the route of the steamship Fun, which departed Auckland in October 1918. The vessel carried passengers infected with influenza. Its first port of call was Western Samoa, despite evident symptoms among the crew. New Zealand authorities permitted the ship to dock and passengers to disembark, without implementing any quarantine measures. What followed was nothing short of apocalyptic. The virus swept across the island like wildfire. The Samoan population lacked immunity. Within just 2 months, 22% of Western Samoa's population, over 500 people perished. Entire villages were utterly destroyed, social structures disintegrated. This region recorded one of the world's highest mortality rates. Yet just 70 kilometers away in American Samoa, a starkly different story unfolded. When news of the global pandemic reached the port via an AVOL radio, the governor of American Samoa, U.S. Navy Commander John Martin Pierre, learned of the outbreak. Ignoring local merchants' fears of economic loss, he made a startling decision. He banned all infected ships from docking and imposed a strict naval quarantine around the islands. All vessels were barred from entering or leaving, completely isolating the islanders from the outside world. Merchants voiced their discontent. The New Zealand government lodged protests. The Pirate stood firm. His decision ultimately saved the islanders. Because of this quarantine barrier, American Samoa recorded 0 deaths during the 1918 influenza pandemic. It stands as the most resounding success story in public health history. To neighboring islands, the same ethnic group, the same virus. One perished through negligence, the other survived through foresight and decisive action. The tragedy of Western Samoa and the triumph of American Samoa demonstrate in starkest contrast that while viruses are nature's messengers, the scale of disaster ultimately hinges on human choices. Philadelphia, Wellington, and Pogo Pogo determined survival or demise during modern history's most severe pandemic. As the world tallied the death toll, a new question emerged. What exactly was this entity? How did it ravage and kill human bodies with such devastating efficiency? The answer lay hidden within the victim's lungs. That brutal battlefield where a fierce microscopic war raged. A certain logic exists in the history of disease. Cruel, yet predictable, plagues always hunt at the edges of life, targeting young children whose immune systems are still developing, and the elderly who have weathered countless winters. The death curve of a typical epidemic forms a distinct U- shape, peaking at both ends of the life spectrum. This pattern as old as disease itself, is an invisible law of biology. Yet in the autumn of 1918, the influenza decided to shatter this law. It crushed the rules with staggering violence, leaving physicians and scientists of the time to gaze at their charts and data with a mixture of disbelief and dread. For the Spanish flu's death curve was not U-shaped, but W-shaped. It did indeed show twin peaks among children and the elderly, as expected. Indeed, but at the very heart of what should have been the survivor's valley, a third spire rose, a monstrous, anomalous peak, piercing the very core of society's lifeline. Adults aged 20 to 40, the strong, the healthy, those in the prime of life. The flu was not merely claiming lives, but decapitated an entire generation. In the barracks, drill sergeants watch in horror as the fittest recruits, young men capable of marching 30 miles fully equipped, collapse first. They dropped suddenly on the parade ground, plunging within hours from vitality to delirium and fever, often dying within a day or two. In munitions factories, young women who replaced men on the front lines, working day and night to keep the war machine running, crowded into makeshift infirmaries. In households, young mothers bearing the responsibility of raising the next generation fell one after another, leaving behind a long line of orphans the world was not prepared to accept. This was the most terrifying and bizarre feature of the pandemic. It completely overturns all traditional medical understanding. Why does a virus, seemingly targeting the lungs, prefer those with the strongest lung function? The answer, fully understood only decades later, is an utterly cruel paradox in biology. It is not the virus itself that directly takes the lives of these healthy individuals, but their own robust physical constitution. That finely tuned immune system becomes the deadly killer. This mechanism is now known as the cytokine storm. To grasp its workings, one must view the immune system as a complex, finely tuned military force, rather than a simple protective shield. When invaders like influenza viruses enter the body, this army mobilizes. It releases chemical signals, cytokines, like battle commands, dispatch white blood cells to this location, amplify the inflammatory response to isolate the enemy, and elevates body temperature to scald the intruders. In a normally balanced immune system, these commands are precise and proportionate. After repelling the invaders, the army withdraws, allowing the body to repair collateral damage. But the 1918 virus was an enemy the human immune system had never encountered. It was a master provocateur. When this virus invaded the lungs of young, healthy adults, the immune system did not respond rationally. Instead, it plunged into panic and fury. The immune command center did not issue combat orders. Instead, it unleashed all commands simultaneously. A cytokine storm erupted. A deafening deluge of chemical signals flooded the entire body, driving every available immune cell to launch a suicidal assault on the lung. The battlefield was the delicate alveolar sacs. In this frenzied race to eliminate the virus, the immune army begins destroying the very territory it was meant to defend. Blood vessels become permeable. Fluid floods, the lungs' white blood cells pile up like mountains. Released enzymes dissolve lung tissue, inflammation rages unchecked. Essentially, the immune system is implementing a scorched -earth policy within the body. The patient's lungs fill with a foamy, bloody mixture. Fluid, dead cells and viral debris intertwined. Victims do not die from the flu itself, but drown in their own bodily fluids. This death is orchestrated by their own defense mechanisms. This process explains the astonishing speed of young patients' disease progression. Their immune systems react faster, more violently, accelerating self-destruction. It also explains the most distinctive symptom of deadly flu, violet cyanosis. When lungs fill with fluid, oxygen cannot enter the bloodstream. The patient's skin takes on a bluish-purple hue starting at the ears, gradually spreading across the entire face. Experienced physicians knew well, once this unsettling violet-purple tint appeared, death was imminent. It was the body's white flag, signaling defeat in the internal battle in the most brutal manner for physicians in 1918. This presented a hellish conundrum. Their customary therapies to bolster bodily defenses often backfired, unwittingly pouring gasoline onto the raging flames of cellular storm. That vibrant vitality, symbol of youth and health, became a death sentence. Natural laws were inverted. The result was a generation that fought the Great War, only to encounter a more ruthless enemy within their own blood, a traitor clad in the armor of the immune system. While scientists scratched their heads over this biological enigma, the virus cared not for their confusion, already plotting its final, cruel blow. By November 1918, the world was brought to its knees. The second wave swept across the globe like wildfire, leaving only mournful silence in its wake. Just as this nightmare seemed poised to end, a single piece of news instantly eclipsed the plague shadow. At 11 o'clock a.m. on November 11th, inside a railway carriage in the Campion Forest, France, the armistice agreement was signed. The slaughter that defined an era, World War I, finally drew to a close. London, Paris, New York, Sydney streets flooded with crowds. Gathering bands, enforced to curb the flu, were utterly disregarded. The collective euphoria was too powerful. Strangers embraced and wept. Soldiers danced with nurses. Church bells and champagne corks filled the air. For a fleeting moment, the world permitted itself to embrace hope. People believed the dual nightmare of war and plague had ended. Yet viruses never abide by peace treaties. As humanity celebrated the 1918 Hone, Nun virus was gathering its final assault. This deadly echo proved human surrender on the battlefield held no meaning for biology. The third wave took shape in the winter of 1918 and persisted into the spring and summer of 1919. It possessed neither the explosive speed of the second wave, nor its absolute lethality. In its relentless adaptation, the virus seemed to have slightly moderated its virulence, or perhaps the surviving global population had acquired some immunity. The cellular memory of that battle granted them a chance to fight back. But reduced fatality rate is a relative concept. The lethality of the third wave still far exceeded any known seasonal flu, and it struck a world already shattered, physically, psychologically, and economically. It was like a boxer knocking down an opponent, only to pull him up for a finishing blow. The transmission pattern of this wave is intrinsically linked to the war's conclusion. Mass demobilization became the primary vector for spread. Millions of soldiers packed trains and transport ships. Embarking on the long journey home, they carried not only battlefield memories, but also the latent virus. Upon reaching their hometowns, heroic homecoming parades and celebrations followed. Ironically, each welcoming event became a new hotbed of infection. In certain regions, the third wave proved particularly devastating. Australia, an island nation that had successfully blocked the second wave with stringent customs quarantine, ultimately could not escape. In January 1919, the virus breached the defences of Sydney and Melbourne, sweeping across the entire continent. For Australians observing the disaster from afar, this pandemic had only just begun. Ultimately, it claimed approximately 15 lives. In Europe and North America, this wave felt more like aftershocks than the main event. But aftershocks are deadly too. Cities like San Francisco, which lifted mask mandates prematurely, were forced to reluctantly reinstate them as cases surged again. Public debate deteriorated as fatigue with restrictions grew. This phenomenon later became known as pandemic fatigue. Even the world's most powerful man was not spared. April 1919, during tense negotiations at the Paris Peace Conference, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson suddenly fainted, officially diagnosed with influenza. His symptoms: sudden high fever, severe coughing, and confusion, coupled with multiple aides falling ill, led most historians to conclude he contracted the third wave of the flu. Though Wilson survived, he was never the same again. Those close to him noticed a transformation in his character. he became more suspicious, stubborn, and inflexible, particularly during negotiations with Britain and France over the Treaty of Versailles. Some argue this illness impaired his judgment at a pivotal historical moment, leading to excessively harsh peace terms imposed on Germany, laying the seeds for World War II. The notion that a tiny virus could alter the course of 20th-century geopolitics compels profound reflection on the fragile nature of human power. The third wave spread from Pacific islands to the Arctic, reaching the globe's most remote corners. Often, ships carrying delayed armistice news became carriers of the virus. It was not until mid-1919 that the pandemic gradually subsided on its own. It did not vanish dramatically, but faded like the lingering glow of dying embers. The virus was not defeated. It simply lacked sufficient unimmunized hosts to sustain explosive transmission. It persisted for years, but had mutated into a less lethal form. It integrated into the seasonal influenza, a cycle humans must coexist with. The ensuing silence was not peace, but exhaustion. The world slowly rose and opened its eyes to the light of a new era. Factories restarted operations. Fields were tilled once more. Soldiers attempted to return to normalcy, yet gaps were visible everywhere. Empty chairs at dinner tables, missing faces in town photographs, names unanswered during roll calls. The war ended. The plague subsided. Only in this quiet moment of global recovery did humanity begin the grim, numinous impossible task of counting the dead. The final tally of a global catastrophe is never an exact science. It is detective work. It is piecing together fragments. It is estimation based on incomplete and often contradictory data. The task of quantifying the 1918 influenza, a pandemic, proved especially daunting. War had destroyed civil registration systems across most of Europe, in many corners of the colonial world. The births and deaths of indigenous peoples went largely unrecorded, or were entirely absent. More complicating factors were inherent in the pandemic itself, which distorted the data. Thousands of deaths were officially attributed to bacterial pneumonia, a condition often serving as the final blow, without mentioning the viral influenza that truly opened the floodgate. Preliminary estimates from the 1920s placed the death toll at around 21 million. This staggering figure already exceeded the combined military and civilian casualties of World War I, yet it remains a severe underestimate. As historians and demographers delved into archives over the decades, revisiting census records, colonial reports, and burial registers, the death toll has risen to chilling heights. Today, the most conservative estimates reach 50 million, with some projections soaring as high as 100 million. Pause for a moment to contemplate this figure. 50 million. In 1918, the global population stood at roughly 1.8 billion. This means that in just over a year, this pandemic claimed 2.7% to 5% of humanity. This was the most rapid and brutal pruning of the human family tree in recorded history. Its absolute death toll far exceeded the Black Death of the 14th century. Approximately 1/3 of the global population, around 500 million people, contracted the disease. By comparison, World War I, an era of industrialized slaughter, claimed between 15 and 20 million military and civilian lives. Yet the flu inflicted double, or even 5 times the death toll in a fraction of the time. Its silent efficiency was beyond the reach of any machine gun. The pandemic's impact was not evenly distributed. The virus ravaged with selective cruelty. The decisive factor was not geographical location, but poverty, malnutrition, and lack of infrastructure. In developed nations like Europe and North America, the mortality rate, though high, remained manageable, accounting for about 0.5% of the population. Yet in other regions, death tolls reached apocalyptic proportions. The epicenter of global mortality was British India, already weakened by malnutrition. India's population was further oppressed by colonial policies prioritizing war efforts over public health. turning it into a slaughterhouse for the virus. Estimates suggest 14 to 20 million Indians perished, far exceeding the combined casualties of World War I. Contemporary accounts described rivers, especially the sacred Ganges, clogged with corpses discarded by families unable or unwilling to perform proper funerals. Funeral pyres burned day and night until all firewood was exhausted, leaving entire villages utterly devastated. In Persia modern-day Iran, the devastation was equally catastrophic. Caught between the British and Russian empires, and ravaged by devastating famine, Iran's population faced the flu with no defenses. Estimates suggest Iran suffered mortality rates of 10% to 25%. This demographic catastrophe took decades for the nation to recover from. Indigenous peoples and isolated communities, having never encountered similar influenza strains, suffered disproportionately. Their immune systems offered no defense whatsoever. In Alaska, some Yupik villages lost 85% to 90% of their population within mere days. In the Pacific Islands, the arrival of a single ship could spell death for an entire island. In Western Samoa, under New Zealand administration, authorities negligently permitted an infected vessel to dock. Within the following 2 months, 22% of the island's population perished. Just miles away, in American Samoa, Navy Governor John Martin Tapuya enforced strict quarantine measures, prohibiting all vessels from docking. American Samoa ultimately recorded 0 flu-related deaths. This pandemic brutally demonstrated the power of public health. Such massive loss of life profoundly and permanently altered population structures. Global life expectancy plummeted. In 1918 U.S. life expectancy dropped by over 12 years. Social structures were shaken to their foundations. The high mortality rate among young people created an entire generation of orphans. Estimates indicate that in South Africa alone, 300,000 children lost both parents. The number of orphans in Philadelphia tripled. These children flooded into underfunded orphanages or were taken in by relatives already struggling to survive, carrying the shadow of trauma for the rest of their lives. Economically, the pandemic triggered massive upheaval. Labor shortages crippled agriculture and industry. Businesses collapsed en masse. Fear confined people to their homes. Commercial activity ground to a halt. Yet, unlike wars that destroy infrastructure, the pandemic claimed only lives. When the pandemic subsided, factories and farms remained standing, awaiting restart. This unique quality, combined with the massive post-war demand, may have fueled the economic boom of the Roaring Twenties. Though this prosperity was built upon collective grief, the most peculiar legacy of the 1918 flu pandemic may not lie in the devastation it wrought, but in how people remember it, or rather, how they forget it. For decades, this demographic catastrophe was relegated to a footnote in World War I history. No grand monuments honor flu victims. No national day of remembrance exists. It descended into a kind of collective amnesia. The trauma was so profound and personal that society preferred to avoid discussing it altogether. Historians have offered several explanations for this great forgetting. War provided a narrative framework of heroism, sacrifice, and national triumph. The pandemic, however, possessed none of these qualities. Death from influenza was often solitary and unglorious, occurring in dim bedrooms or crowded wards. There was no enemy to blame, nor medals to be won. This privatized family tragedy spread on a scale multiplied 1,000. More crucially, people were utterly exhausted, yearning to forget the pain and embrace life in the new decade. Thus, the story of humanity's most severe plague gradually faded from focus, becoming a silent specter in the memory of the 20th century. The hidden warning signifies that humanity's greatest threat may not come from the barrel of a gun, but sometimes from an invisible assault within the slightest breath. Then the clamor subsided. Not instantly, of course. The world spent long hours clearing makeshift hospitals, dismantling canvas tents and parks, and dismantled makeshift morgues. With the clamor of the pandemic itself, that chorus of coughs that once defined the city's soundscape, finally faded away. It fell silent, town by town, household by household, until one day, when the world awoke, it was met with a near-minus deafening stillness. This silence was filled with the void of absence, and what followed was perhaps the most perplexing chapter in this history. Forgetting, a collective amnesia, a catastrophe, whose depth and vastness were almost as baffling as the pandemic itself. For decades, this plague, which claimed more lives than World War I, has been reduced to a footnote in history books, a faint whisper lingering only in family memories. How could this be? How could humanity erase such a catastrophe from its consciousness? The answer, as always, is far from simple. This is trauma, a result of convenience intertwined with human nature. The primary cause is the shadow of war looming over it. World War I was a spectacular trauma made visible, possessing a clear narrative, heroes and villains, defined battle frontiers, medals, parades, most importantly, monuments. This war was a man-minus made tragedy, and thus one humanity could remember. Triumphal arches rose from the earth. Rows of white crosses stood on the Flanders fields. Bronze plaques engraved with countless names. This is a sacrifice humanity can comprehend, celebrate, and remember. Humanity seems to favor disasters clad in military uniform, adorned with medals. In contrast, the flu was invisible, nameless, faceless killer. It fought for no flag, nor for any ideal. It claimed lives in kitchens, bedrooms, and trams. The battlefield was within the human body. Victims did not fall heroically on glorious battlefields, but drowned silently in their own beds, their lungs filled with fluid. No monuments are built for the flu. No statues stand for the medical workers who died simply for doing their duty. The timeline itself is the crucial factor. The second and deadliest wave of the pandemic peaked between October and November 1918, precisely overlapping with the war's final death throes. November 11, 1918, as the armistice was signed, and crowds flooded the streets of London, Paris, and New York to celebrate. They passed by carts collecting corpses, wearing masks. The ecstasy of peace drowned out the moans of the sick. The world craved victory, and a happy ending, and the war's conclusion delivered precisely that. The relentless pandemic became a narrative flaw, a grim ep, a log no one wished to read. Newspapers finally freed from wartime censorship, dedicated front pages to the Versailles peace talks, Iraq's redrawn borders, and blueprints for the future. The virus, of course, read no newspapers. While world leaders debated nations' destinies, it raged on in silence. During the Paris Peace Conference of spring 1919, President Woodrow Wilson himself fell gravely ill, though this was downplayed and concealed. Historians like John M. Berry have documented it likely severely impaired his negotiating capacity, consequences that even altered the course of the 20th century. Yet even such a momentous event was swept under the rug. The world yearned to move forward, and indeed, it did move forward. The wounds inflicted by war and plague gave way to near-minus hysterical denial. The Roaring Twenties, a decade deliberately crafted for frenzy, a raucous party, attempting to drown out the echoes of sirens and death knell-s. Jazz music, swinging women, moonshine, stock market frenzy, all part of a collective effort to look ahead, to live fast and fiercely, as if to make up for lost time. Talking about the flu was considered improper, equivalent to bringing death to the party, evoking memories of fragility, helplessness and fear. In this era yearning to celebrate strength and unbreakable optimism, families who lost loved ones often chose silence. It was a private death, often shrouded in shame, out of step with the dazzling new world built upon the ashes of the old. The trauma remained undigested, merely suppressed. Ultimately, it was the nature of the disease itself, unlike the Black Death, which left an indelible mark on medieval art, literature, and religion. The 1918 flu struck with sudden ferocity and profound medical bewilderment. It urged and receded in waves over less than 2 years. Scientists of the time could not even pinpoint its cause. Many remained convinced it was caused by the bacterium Pasteurella. They lacked the language and tools to identify the true culprit, a virus too small to be observed through microscopes of the era. The absence of a clear enemy and solid scientific understanding made this chapter of history harder to tell. There was no narrative of discovery or medical triumph, only chapters of survival and loss. Thus, the deadliest killer of the 20th century became a ghost, a global family secret. Decades later, a new generation of ghost hunters, armed with genetic tools, would finally awaken the culprit from its grave, forcing it to reveal its secrets. Silence cannot last forever. The mystery runs too deep, and the human desire to seek truth is too strong. The hunt is about to begin. For nearly 80 years, the 1918 virus existed only as a ghostly presence, a collection of statistical data, brown minus stone photographs of hospital wards, and fading memories. The pathogen itself, that killer, had vanished from the Earth's surface, at least on the surface. But in the scientific community, nothing is more alluring than an unsolved mystery, especially one accompanied by such staggering death tolls. In the latter half of the 20th century, a group of scientists driven by curiosity and unprecedented urgency embarked on the most extraordinary forensic quest in history, to find the 1918 virus. Their goal, plainly stated, was to resurrect the killer, not out of morbid curiosity, but to neutralize its threat and learn how to defeat its descendants. The first hurdle was immense. In 1918, virology was in its infancy. Scientists could neither isolate, nor cultivate, nor even visually observe viruses. Thus no laboratory samples of the original pathogen existed. To find it, they had to search where the virus completed its final work, within the victim's remains. The problem was that this virus, a fragile RNA chain encased in protein, degrades at an astonishing rate after the host's death. Finding viable samples after the passage of time was akin to searching for a needle in a pile of rotting hay. The first crucial clue pointed to the frigid Arctic. Permafrost acts as a natural freezer. Their theory was simple. If flu victims were buried in permafrost, the virus might be preserved within their lung tissue. This concept deeply captivated a young, daring Swedish pathologist named Johan Holing. In 1951, Holing, then a graduate student, organized an expedition to the remote Inuit village of Breivik Mission in Alaska. This settlement had been devastated by the influenza pandemic. In just 5 days in November 1918, the flu claimed 72 of the village's 80 residents. Authorities hastily buried the bodies in a mass grave, marked only by 2 white crosses above the frozen ground. After obtaining permission from village elders, Hoglin began his work. He described the scene as surreal. He and his team worked under the midnight sun of the Arctic summer, digging through permafrost tundras hard as concrete. Finally, at 2 meters deep, they discovered bodies perfectly preserved beneath the ice. Hain carefully sampled lung tissue from corpses, planning to use standard techniques of the time to cultivate live virus in fertilized chicken eggs. Full of hope, he flew back to his Iowa laboratory. Yet the technology of 1951 proved inadequate for the task. Despite exhaustive efforts, the virus remained impossible to cultivate. This deadly pathogen lingered like an elusive spectre. Hain's attempts ended in failure. He published his findings, preserved some tissue samples informal in solution, and subsequently shifted his research focus. This quest seemed to have reached a dead end. Nearly 5 decades passed. The world changed. Science underwent a revolution. The 1953 discovery of the DNA double helix ushered in the era of molecular genetics. The 1992 brought a powerful new polymerase chain reaction PCR. This enabled scientists to amplify tiny fragments of degraded genetic material millions of times over, creating sufficient material for study. In an instant, a live, intact virus was no longer essential. Only its genetic remnants were needed, an echo at the molecular level. At this moment, a new hunter entered the fray, Dr. G. Alban Berg, a molecular virologist at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C. Alban Berg had a flash of insight. The institute housed a vast archive of tissue samples, preserved for military autopsies dating back to the Civil War. He hypothesized that among thousands of wax-sealed tissue blood might lie organ samples from victims of the 1918 flu. Indeed, he discovered a lung sample from 21-year-old soldier Roscoe Vaughn, who had died in September 1918 at a camp in South Carolina. The tissue was in extremely poor condition, with viral RNA fragmented into minute pieces. For years, Dr. T. Alban Berg and team member Drive and Reed worked with meticulous precision like genetic archaeologists, extracting and attempting to reassemble these fragments in the correct sequence was an extraordinarily slow and frustrating endeavor, like trying to piece together an entire novel from scattered scraps of paper. In 1997, they achieved a breakthrough, publishing the sequences of several genes from the virus, which captured the attention of the scientific community. The quest began anew. The story took a dramatic turn in San Francisco, where a 72-year-old retired pathologist read Tabor N. Berg's paper published in Science Journal. This man was John Holton, the very same John Holton who had excavated the Alaskan permafrost half a century earlier. He grasped the crucial clue. Tabor N. Berg's tissue samples were severely degraded, but he knew where to find superior specimens. He precisely knew the location of the Breivik mission mass grave. Without hesitation, Holton picked up the phone and called Tabor. After identifying himself, he made a startling proposal. He would personally fund a return trip to Breivik mission to obtain better samples for Tabor. Thus, in August 1997, nearly 50 years after his first attempt, the energetic septuagenarian Holden flew back to Alaska. He again secured village permission and hired local youth to assist with the excavation, recalling the burial site precisely. After 4 days, they penetrated the permafrost and uncovered a body, Holden with reverence and personal affection, and named her Lucy. Lucy's body was exceptionally well preserved. The layer of fat formed by her obese physique acted as an extra insulating layer that protected her internal organs from the destructive freeze-thaw cycle. With surgical precision, Holton opened her chest cavity and retrieved lung tissue. The lungs appeared dark and congested, filled with blood, just as described in the 1918 autopsy report. The virus had utterly devastated the lung tissue. Holton sampled the tissue, placed it in preservative, and sent it via priority mail to the Thunberg laboratory. 10 days later, Thunberg's colleague again Reed called Horton with crucial news. The sample was in perfect condition. The viral RNA content was exceptionally high. Thanks to this retired pathologist's persistence, they finally obtained sufficient genetic material to reconstruct the killer virus's complete genome. Over the following years, the T.Y.N. Berg team patiently deciphered the 8 RNA segments composing the 1918 virus genome within a high-security laboratory. By 2005, this work was finally completed. The Spectre had acquired a genetic visage. What secrets did the virus ultimately reveal? The findings were chilling. It confirmed the virus was indeed avian-origin Hone, non-influenza. But unlike most avian flu strains that require adaptation through intermediate hosts like pigs to infect humans, this strain jumped directly from birds to humans. It acquired critical mutations that not only enabled infection of human cells, but also allowed it to replicate with astonishing speed and virulence. particularly deep within the lungs, a region seasonal flu rarely reaches. Halton and T. Ambert's research revealed the mechanisms behind these lethal mutations. The virus triggered such an intense and uncontrolled immune response, now widely known as the cytokine storm, that the body's own defense system turned against the lungs. Young, healthy individuals with robust immune systems became the most vulnerable victims. Their very strength became a fatal weakness. The reconstruction of the 1918 virus genome represents not only a scientific triumph, but also a warning. By identifying the molecular markers that made this virus deadly, scientists have established a genetic surveillance checklist. Should a new influenza strain emerge with identical characteristics, alarm bells will sound early. The quest to track the spectre of 1918 has provided us with a genetic treasure map to locate its successors. Yet unresolved questions. This question, which will pierce the heart for decades to come, lies in whether the world, possessing this knowledge, can decipher this map in time. For the story of the Spanish flu is not merely about virology and collective amnesia, but an epic of lessons paid for dearly, yet repeatedly forgotten. The legacy of the 1918 pandemic is itself a paradox. On one hand, it became a silent catalyst for profound transformations in medicine and public health. On the other, it stands as a prime example of humanity's selective amnesia and its tendency to repeat the same mistakes. Looking back at the ashes of 1918, we glimpse an unsettling echo in contemporary society. It reminds us that despite leaps in technology, collective psychology, political responses, and fundamental vulnerabilities remain largely unchanged. As the pandemic subsided, medical and governmental circles at least recognized a systemic collapse. This crisis exposed the fragility of global public health systems, prompting many nations to establish or strengthen health ministries. Europe founded the League of Nations Health Organization, precursor to the World Health Organization. Epidemiology rose from an obscure discipline to a cornerstone of modern medicine. Global disease surveillance. The importance of data collection and coordinated responses began to dawn. In a sense, a modern public health system was born from the trauma of 1918. People realized that a microbe somewhere in the world could become a threat to all humanity. This lesson became even more profound in the jet age and the era of global trade. However, these institutional lessons often failed to permeate public consciousness or form lasting political will. Memories gradually fade, urgency dissipates. Yet now, history's echoes grow louder and more unsettling. Take non-pharmaceutical public health measures, so called social distancing, as an example. In 1918, lacking vaccines and antiviral drugs, cities employed identical tactics to those of the 21st century, closing schools, theaters and public venues, banning mass gatherings, mandating gauze masks. The outcomes from that era remain highly instructive case studies to this day. The experiences of two American cities, Philadelphia and St. Louis, have become textbook examples. Philadelphia ignored warnings and insisted on holding a large parade to raise war funds. Within days, the epidemic spread throughout the city, resulting in the highest death rate in the nation. In contrast, St. Louis took strong social distancing measures early on, achieving a death rate less than half that of Philadelphia. The lesson is clear. Swift, decisive action saves lives. Yet, over a century later, cities worldwide continue to replay the same debates, the same hesitations, the same tug-of war between economic interest and public health. The mask controversy is a striking echo of history. In 1918, mask mandates were widely enforced across many cities, particularly in the American West. The resistance then mirrored today's protests exactly. Anti-mask coalitions emerged. For instance, San Francisco protesters claimed the mandate infringed on personal liberty, and that masks' efficacy remained unproven. Newspapers were filled with reports of citizens fined or arrested for not wearing masks, alongside public debates about masks' practicality. Though technology has advanced, the debate over individual responsibility versus collective benefit remains almost identical. In the fertile ground of fear and uncertainty, misinformation and the pursuit of miracle cures also flourished. In 1918, people clung to all manner of unproven remedies, from camphor poultices around the neck to eating onions and gargling with disinfectants. Advertisements aggressively promoted tonics and panaceas claiming to prevent the flu. One widespread, yet tragically misguided remedy involved massive doses of aspirin, then a relatively new drug. Desperate physicians sometimes prescribed what we now recognize as lethal doses that may have contributed to some deaths by inducing pulmonary hemorrhage. Replace aspirin and camphor with hydrochlorins or ivermectin. Swap newspaper ads for viral social media posts. This pattern bears an eerie resemblance. The techniques for spreading misinformation have become incredibly efficient, yet humanity's psychological urge to seek simple solutions to complex, terrifying problems remains unchanged. Perhaps the most chilling echo is the resurgence of nationalism and the absence of international cooperation. The pandemic was dubbed the Spanish flu, not because it originated in Spain, but because neutral Spain imposed no press censorship to avoid dampening morale. Spanish newspapers, however, reported freely on the outbreak, misleading the world into believing Spain was the epicenter. This tendency to blame others recurred with every new pandemic. The 1918 pandemic worsened, precisely because a world torn apart by war prevented information sharing. Nations prioritized their own interests. A century later, despite the existence of global health organizations and unprecedented worldwide connectivity, we still witness border closures, nations scrambling for resources like ventilators or vaccines, nationalist rhetoric seeking scapegoats rather than collaborative solutions. Pandemics are global problems demanding global solutions. This may be the hardest lesson to grasp. Finally, the significance of 1918 extends beyond metaphor to biological reality. The 1918 Ho-Nun virus never truly vanished. It underwent attenuation and mutation, evolving into seasonal flu strains circulating for decades. Its genes continuously recombined with avian and swine influenza viruses, spawning subsequent outbreaks throughout the 20th century, such as the 1957 Asian flu H2N2 and the 1968 Hong Kong flu H3N2. Both are distant genetic descendants of that 1918 monster. Even the 2009 swine flu pandemic was triggered by a new variant of Ho-Nun, the great-grandchildren of the original virus. This spectre not only haunts the pages of history books, but literally survives within the genetic code of viruses infecting humans today. The story of this pandemic remains a cautionary tale. Like a mirror, it reflects how our advanced technology often masks our primal vulnerability. It teaches us that memory is like a muscle that atrophies without exercise. It reminds humanity that the most vital lessons do not come from triumphs, but from the most devastating failures. The 1918 pandemic was neither the beginning nor the end of humanity's long war with microbes. It was merely the bloodiest battle fought thus far. The lessons of that battle are etched upon millions of forgotten gravestones, awaiting the day we are finally ready to decipher and remember, before the silence descends once more.